Good afternoon, I'm Denise Hill, so I'm the CPD rep for BASES. I'm going to hand over to Paul in a moment and our amazing presenters, but I just wanted to extend a warm welcome really to you all. So this is the third and final webinar in our BASES and BPS collaborative webinar series. Can't believe it's our final one of the summer, which is creating psychologically safe environments for performance and wellbeing, which would be absolutely fantastic, I know. It's been an amazing series. I hope you've all enjoyed. I note from some of the names coming on the chat box that many of you have attended all three, which is awesome. Thank you for your support. And I think this event, this series, has really paved the way for more future collaborative events between BPS and BASES, which can only be a benefit for our members and our profession. So I'd like to say, before I hand you over to Paul, many thanks for all of your support in attending. Thanks very much to all our presenters today and our previous webinars, Paul and Alison. And of course, thanks to all of the individuals, and there are too many to mention today because we need to get on with the presentation, but thanks to all of those who've worked tirelessly behind the scenes at BASES and at BPS to ensure this series has run so smoothly. I hope you've enjoyed it, hope you've benefited, and really looking forward to putting some more on next year. So please do get hold of us with your ideas. So further ado, I will hand over to Paul.
Thanks, Denise. Hello, everybody. I'm Paul Morgan, the CPD for DSEP. And I hope you don't mind me also just expressing a few thanks to people, the events and marketing team for BASES and DSEP. So that's Angus Boyle, Emily Pattinson, Sue Watson, and our excellent leads across both organisations. So Zoe Knowles, Ian Wilson, Richard Thelwell, Rob Morris, and also former DSEP chair, Stu Cottrell, who I know he was very actively supporting this collaboration. So it's brilliant that it's come off. As Denise said, we'd really like to welcome your feedback for future events. And just before we introduce the speakers for today, just to remind everyone, we will have a chance to invite some questions, certainly at the end, and there may be an opportunity during the webinar itself. So turning to the webinar, really delighted to introduce Rebecca Symes and Chris Marshall. Chris and Rebecca both work as senior psychologists at the Football Association. Rebecca works with the England Women's Senior Team, while Chris leads the player development programme for the men's pathway. And of course, many of you know that Rebecca and Chris have worked in a range of sports at international level, including the Paralympic and Olympic Games. So Rebecca and Chris, without further ado, over to you to tell us a little bit more about the construct of psychological safety. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul, and hi everyone. I'm just having a quick look at the old chat box there, Marcia, and I see we seem to be going international. I think Marie and Mauritius may well be the furthest afield for this one this afternoon, but hi to everyone on this webinar. I think it's probably fair to say that we'd like to start with probably a little bit of vulnerability around the fact that actually presenting to your fellow psychology colleagues actually feels far more nerve-wracking than standing in front of a group of athletes or coaches, but hopefully we will do our best to share some of our kind of insight with you guys this afternoon, and thank you very much for giving up your time and joining us this afternoon. Hopefully it should be
I'll support Bex on that. I know it's warm today. I'm sweating. I'm genuinely nervous about today. It's probably the nervous I've been for a very long time, and I'm very jealous of the person that's from Mauritius, because for me, I'd love to be there now. Absolutely.
Great stuff. Okay, should we get started? I'm doing the whole screen stuff today, so if anything goes wrong, I apologise, but I will do my best to hopefully make sure it doesn't. Okay, so I think we'd like to kind of really start off by getting you guys to put some stuff in the chat box for us around what it is about what caught your attention about today's webinar, first of all, just so we can get a bit of insight from you guys as to perhaps what you might be expecting and what you're hoping for. So give us some insight in the chat box now in terms of what caught your attention about today's webinar. We'll give you a moment to do that.
I think this is where we're supposed to pad, isn't it, at this point, where they're filling.
Really? You're good at that.
Filling the,
you can
no, not at all. I think I will say, I will pad a little bit. I will try. I think one thing that we'll try and allude to as we go through today is, I think myself and Bex have spent a fair bit of time over the last few weeks or so trying to pull this together and thinking how best to pitch it at a level of some psychologists who we know here have got huge experience, some are researchers in this area particularly, and some are new and on the training route, and I hope are really enjoying their stage 2 or their SEPAR experiences that they're going through now. I think some of our expectation today is that the theory work we'll absolutely cover some of the key theories as we see it, but we're going to try and make sure we've got as many practical examples, some simple we think, and some maybe a little bit more complicated to try and initiate, so that people feel as though you can actually take something from this session and go and do it. And hopefully that's the key thing for us, is that we're able to try and do that for you guys today.
The chat box is going wild. I think I probably underestimated this amount of people and my ability to read quickly, whilst it seems to, every time I start to read, it seems to disappear and scroll up the page. But some of the things to pick out there in terms of about, you know, sort of how it actually applies in the real world, in terms of how do we start to create some of these environments. I think someone said, will there be a recording available? I think the answer to that is yes, just seeing that question there. Anything you're picking up there, Marshy? Particular note?
Well, I mean a little bit maybe what I've just said, and we will definitely do that today, which is the practical bits. I think sharing some vulnerability, what we're gonna share today has elements of contextual understanding to it. So I think we fundamentally appreciate some of the practical examples that we are going to share might really work well in football, but might not work well in a different sport, and vice versa. So I think recognizing context all the way through this will be crucial. But yeah, it's great to see that a lot of the comments are always about how to apply this stuff. So yeah, we will definitely be referencing some theory, because evidence-based practice is crucial and important. But yeah, the practical bits will be, I'm hoping, will be boxed off to a level where you guys think I've got something I can take away today.
I think that bit about context is important. I see, I think it might have been Kerry possibly said about that she currently is working with teachers in schools. So although we'll kind of be talking about a sports environment, we certainly believe the principles and the concepts can be applied across environments, and hopefully you'll get that as we go through. Happy to move on, Marshy?
Yeah, do it.
Okay. So if we start off by thinking about actually what is a psychologically safe environment, and a lot of stuff around psychological safety is kind of, you know, originally coined by Amy Edmondson. Those people who may have read her book, it's a brilliant book called Fearless Organisation. She summarises a lot of her research in that. So if you want to do further kind of reading into this topic, that's a great place to start. But what really a psychologically safe environment is deemed as is one where the climate is perceived safe enough for interpersonal risk. And what we mean by that is that people feel that they're able to be vulnerable enough to speak up in those environments, to ask questions, to, you know, put forward their ideas, to be able to say, actually, I don't know, or I've made a mistake, without almost that fear of retribution, without the fear of perhaps being made to feel embarrassed or shamed, or, you know, being made to feel that you're not good enough. And it's an interesting concept, and it's the idea that we're talking about psychological safe environments, and the word risk in there is something that Marshy and I have kind of debated through this. And I think, Marshy, you wanted to kind of speak a little about this, particularly in relation to kind of discussions we've had with coaches around that word safety and risk.
Yeah, for me, it's really important, and it goes back to sort of evidence-based practice, really. And there's no refuting, I don't think, the definition of psychological safety, and particularly Eamon Evans's work. I think it's exceptional, and it's really applied, and it's brilliant to read. But the pragmatics of dealing in elite sport is when you use the term risk, people think, well, that just feels a bit juxtaposed with the term safe. Like, I shouldn't be thinking about making a risk if I feel safe. And for me, that was something that was really important to share, because as psychologists, I feel we can often be guilty of sometimes taking something from the theory, going, okay, let's apply this now into the world, and using some of the same language. And I can think of multiple coaches that have said to me, well, if we get this environment right, it shouldn't be about risk. People shouldn't feel it's a risk to be themselves. They should just be comfortable with being themselves and what it means to be themselves. So I want to really highlight that as we go through, is where will this language land, and actually where do you maybe need to tweak it, recognizing that I'm coming from an evidence-based perspective. And I suppose that the second piece on that I do want to highlight is referencing the title of today's session. This isn't just about performance, it's about well-being as well. And both myself and Bex's view, and I hope it would be seen as consistent across everybody really, I hope, that have come to watch this today and listen to this today, is that we fundamentally believe that sustained performance is built on a strong base of well-being. And that for me does come from that it feels like I can be myself and that I matter. And I think if people are able to do both of those things, then we're starting to be in a position where it feels psychologically safe. Which takes us on to, I know this is my first admission today. I have a huge crush on Google as a business. Now this is really tough because as a presenter, I need to know if my jokes are landing or not, and I have absolutely no idea if this is the case or not. So as long as you keep smiling, Bex, I'll be happy. Look, I think we all have heard and we've all seen the stuff that Google do. I feel really fortunate that in one of the collaborations through the FA, I've been able to spend time with a couple of members of staff at Google and try and understand a little bit of their work into people and people development. And I'm having a little bit of expectation that some of you guys may have come across Project Aristotle before, which is Google's project around what makes a perfect team. But for those that haven't, I want to give a really brief insight into it. So it's a 4-year study that started in 2012 using 180 teams, which equated to around about 37,000 employees. And what I really like about Google is when they go, we want to understand something, for me, they just do it properly and they go after it and they invest time, resource and energy into doing it. And Project Aristotle is just one example of a wonderful project that they've done. For those of you interested, Project Oxygen was another project that they did at Google, which was what makes a great manager as opposed to what makes a perfect team. But that 4-year study, which is they looked after 37,000 employees, found it was mattered less about who was in the team, but more about how the team worked together. And I think if we reflect on that as individuals and we take a moment to think about the teams that we work in, it feels quite true, doesn't it? It's absolutely less about who and more about how. And what came out of their research, which for those of you, if you do Google it, it's the New York Times article is probably one of the most simple and best articles to go through for it. It gave you a really nice insight. And Bex, if you can move on to the next slide for me, their sort of website rework has lots of information and further information about it. But fundamentally, there were 5 things that jumped out of their research and their project. And I don't think it would surprise us that psychological safety was number 1. And it was fundamentally that. Team members felt safe, yes, to take risks, but to be vulnerable in front of each other. And we're hopefully going to try and model a little bit of that vulnerability with some of the practical examples that we share today. And I don't think we would argue that when you start to look at the next pieces, dependability, structure, meaning, impact, they all feel really important. But again, anecdotally, I think experiences that we will have had as psychologists feel that solid base of safety enables things like dependability, structure and clarity, meaning and impact to kind of shine through a little bit more. And for me, alongside Amy's work, this is a wonderful example of how important this topic is for teams to be really effective.
I think
that moves us on, Bex.
Yeah, I think Marcia and I also have this kind of debate that probably our strength, I guess, is our experience in the in the applied world and actually doing this day to day. But we want to make sure we do give a bit of a nod to the research that's gone on, because like Marcia said before, we do like to ensure that our practice is evidence-based. And when we kind of look at the evidence base around psychological safety, there's probably 20-30 years worth of research now in this area. And if you try and kind of summarize, I guess, all of that research into some particular things that feel kind of most pertinent and most relevant and seem to have the most backing behind them, I think we can end up talking about these 3 things of learning, innovation and engagement. So I think to take learning as kind of like the first one. We know from the research that's been done that psychological safety does help to facilitate learning, and largely because it reduces the potential for embarrassment. And we know that if people are in an environment where they feel actually if I question whether I know something, you know, should I ask that question, should I not, and they're worried that they might be embarrassed, then actually they're less likely to kind of seek out that information, and therefore that's going to have an impact on their learning. And actually some of the research, that was systematic review that was done, I think in 2017 by Newman and colleagues, kind of found that actually the impact on kind of learning and performance was, you know, true at all levels. So from an individual learning perspective, also from a team perspective, and from an organizational perspective as well. And to try and put this into a bit of real life context and provide a bit of an example in terms of how we've tried to approach this webinar, I don't know if there's any Disney fans on here, or if anybody has been watching on Disney Plus the program about the making of Frozen 2 and Into the Unknown. Really recommend checking it out if you haven't. But one of the concepts they do there is that pretty much every single day they do something called dailies, which is where different departments and different people present back to the rest of the people their work. So if you imagine the animation team in the early days go and present where they've got to so far to a room full of all their colleagues, and basically everybody provides kind of some really quite harsh critical feedback to kind of give their view on where this is at. And it probably, when you watch it, think, oh, this feels a little bit tough, a little bit harsh, but it's done in the spirit that everybody feels that actually this feedback is vital for making the film better, which is ultimately the goal that everybody is aligned towards. And so it's a really good insight into that. And, you know, Marcia and I putting this webinar together, we actually took our earlier version of this, our draft version, if you like, to our psychology team at the FA and ran the session for them in order to get some feedback on how this landed with people and what bits, you know, do we think would be most relevant. And, you know, again, that was a really useful exercise for us to do. And we try and encourage people to do that. And we try and have this principle where we talk about everything as a draft. And I think sometimes it's a question of how willing we are to be vulnerable in terms of recognizing that, you know, other people giving feedback and being critical isn't necessarily a personal criticism, but it can be aimed at helping us to become better and to learn. So I think we really try and embody some of the spirit of this idea of learning and taking on board the feedback. The other area.
Yeah, Bex, can I just add in on that, Bex?
Yeah, please do.
I wouldn't underestimate. I feel really fortunate to work at the FA in that we have a psychology team of 6 full-time members of staff, and what that means is we are afforded the luxury of time with great psychologists. So we were able to put a session in. We put an hour in the diary, and our session was pulled apart by Ian Mitchell, Jen Bennett, Claire Davidson, to actually start to pull it. Say, well, that might land, that might not land. What's your thinking behind that? But that doesn't necessarily just have to be a group of psychologists to do that. I know at the EIS, there's a wonderful culture of checking and challenging and sharing work within the psychology team there. But you can do it in other places as well. You can share your work with coaches, with friends, with family, with peers. I mean, group supervision for me should be a lifelong experience, not just something you do when you complete your training. But feeling vulnerable enough to do that and role model that, for me, hopefully it makes this session far more meaningful for you guys today. And actually, I learned a huge amount through doing that with my peers and my colleagues as well. And I know someone has just boxed on the chat there. Thank you for absolutely love Frozen 2. I cannot reiterate that enough. Like the first 15 minutes of episode 1 for me that feels like high performance. It feels like to pinch some of the work from Mustafa, who I think is on here. Like it felt like high challenge, high support. It felt like that. It felt like they're going to absolutely pull your work to pieces, but they're going to really help you get through that as well. And that for me is the essence of why we did what we did, but also the essence of wicked performance as well. Sorry, Bex.
No, that's good. The other aspect around kind of psychological safety and engagement is that actually if people feel that there is safety, psychological safety in the environment, then they're more willing to actually get involved in things. And just as a really simple practical example of kind of a workshop I've run before in the men's under-21s with the England players, is trying to think about kind of this idea of actually, you know, when we kind of run a session as a psychologist, and the typical thing of stand at the front and kind of get people to write on flip charts, which, you know, I do and have done many times, actually that group of players I was working with, that just doesn't really work for them. That's not really their world. So actually trying to get the engagement there doesn't feel particularly safe, because they don't feel comfortable speaking up in front of the other lads, you know, or some of them don't feel comfortable writing. So actually we tried out using, like, getting them to go away and film the answers. So we set them some questions prior to European Championship, set them some questions, said, look, go away, you don't need to do it in front of us, but go away and film your answers to some of these things. You can create videos if you want to, you can do it on your own, do it in a group, however best you think you want to kind of answer this question. And I have to say there was a bit of resistance initially from coaches to say, oh, do we really think this is going to be the right thing? Is this going to land? Are the lads going to want to do it? And I have to say they absolutely loved it, because they'd suddenly been given the freedom to go and, you know, innovate and be creative and come up with different ways. And what they came back with was brilliant in terms of some of their answers and their responses and the ways that, and actually the acting skills that some of them had. So, you know, trying to kind of get that sense of creating a safe environment where they feel you're working with them is really helpful. And I think the piece around engagement as well is almost kind of linked to the attachment theory, that if people feel they've got a secure base, then they're more willing to then obviously explore. And Bex
will probably Bex will underplay that, knowing what Bex is like from that work that she did with the 21s, and we get a fair bit of resistance at times, and we can get resistance. We've all experienced that. But I would also say that Bex had a coaching group that was really open to then doing that as well. So whilst that early resistance was there, the system felt as though, okay, well, let's go with it. Let's try it out. And I think what we learned really quickly, and I think people have probably learned through this lockdown experience that we've had, is as soon as you put a bit more trust and a bit more faith in young people, they'll probably go and exceed your expectations anyway. And for me, it was a wicked example that was really well done.
It did nearly get pulled 10 minutes before to give the real honest story, but I managed to win them round. There was a bit of a panic before anyway. We did it.
That's okay.
And that last one there around kind of the innovation and creativity and problem solving. You know, again, we know that sense, like, you know, if you're trying to be creative, it does involve a bit of risk taking and experimentation. And if people feel safe, you're more likely to get that side out of them. It's worth kind of saying that people, like, a lot of this research has been done predominantly in the corporate world and business kind of environments, and actually there's very, very little research in sport on this. So a lot of the time we're kind of taking concepts from business and kind of going, we think they kind of apply, because, you know, we particularly talk about psychological safety being important in environments where there's kind of high levels of complexity and high levels of uncertainty, and we know that certainly represents the sports world. But it's great to see, and I think the guys are on the line today, Desmond and Mustafa, I think, and are on the line today. So I hope I try and briefly do your work some justice in terms of, literally, they've just published with Catherine Franson as well, a paper looking at psychological safety in sport in handball. And I won't go into too much detail, but just to kind of say, I think from their study is really probably one of the first to really replicate some of these findings from business in the sports world, which is really, really encouraging. And they're, you know, finding that actually psychological safety, you know, does have an impact on team functioning and effectiveness, and also importantly on athlete well-being. So they found that there was kind of the psychological safety kind of was negatively related to athlete burnout and positively related to athlete health. So that's some really encouraging signs. So to you guys on the call, I know you would have worked hard on that paper, so thank you for starting to kind of bring some of this research into the sports world, and hopefully it will encourage other researchers as well to try and look at this in sport, so we can be even more confident that we're basing this on the context of the actual environments that we do work in.
Can I just take a very quick pause, Paul? I know Michael's just asked a question around identity. I don't think we won't answer that now, but can you make a note of it so that we can try and make sure we answer it towards the end? Because I think it's a really important one to ask, and I don't want to lose it.
So I think the other thing that's really important, and actually this might link to Paul, what you're just putting in the chat box there around getting teams to understand it and the importance of it, is I think sometimes our discipline can sometimes, if we're not careful, be associated, certainly words that I know have been chucked at Marsh and I about our discipline can be a little bit fluffy. And actually, if we're not careful, psychological safety can be put into that bracket, that it's always, this is just all about being nice. And we want to be really clear here about what psychological safety isn't. It is not just about being nice. This is not about everybody agreeing and getting on with each other for the sake of doing that, because actually that doesn't make a productive environment. So actually, it's creating the environment where you can have healthy conflict and you can have a free exchange of ideas without that concern that kind of there'll be consequences of that ultimately. Marsh, do you want to share your example of kind of how you might have tried to create that previously?
Yeah, and this may feel a little false, but it had a really positive impact in the context that I was operating in. So I feel really fortunate to have worked with some really good coaches, some really good guys, and some great people. And when I was at England Cricket, we were on a particular tour, and one of the head coaches who I was working with at the time, known for being a little bit feisty, I think would be polite, very driven, wonderful character, but was very clear on what he wanted and how he wanted to operate. But he was also quite mindful that he was aware that some coaches maybe didn't always feel safe enough to be able to offer their views in big team meetings, mindful that how he might respond or how he might challenge them. But myself and this coach had a really quite a tight relationship, which I worked really hard on. So we kind of agreed that there was something that I definitely disagreed with, and for the life of me, I can't really remember what it was to this day. But we agreed that I was going to challenge him on it in the meeting in front of everybody. We were going to have a debate about it. But people would then notice that he was no different with me afterwards. Like, he wasn't now going to be cold with me or give me like shitty jobs to do or anything like that. He was going to be consistent with me, regardless of how we interact with each other in that setting. So we did it. We went through it. And a few of the coaches around went, "Oh, you were really brave there to challenge him like that." I was like, "Well, I didn't feel brave. It felt like it was the right thing to do." And people noticed. People noticed he was consistent with me. He didn't change. And then we shared this with the group towards the end of the tour. That was why we did it. But we wanted to create a bit of space for people to go, "Oh, hang on, I can challenge this coach, and things won't feel different, and they won't be there." And that coach has gone on a long journey of sort of shifting his philosophy a little bit and changing some of the perceptions that people have of him. But that was like a little practical moment where we were aware of how he was perceived, and we're gonna talk a little bit about power in a second, which Bex is gonna wonderfully lead on. But it was a great example of power at play, and it was a short-term strategy to try and shift something quickly, which eventually had a long-term benefit to not just him, but to also the other coaches that were working on that particular tour. And for those that have worked in cricket or have spent time understanding cricket, tours can be long and tours can be hard work. So trying to get some of that stuff on the table early doors, we felt was important.
Yeah. So yeah, like we say, it's not therefore just about this sense of being nice. We should be able to have conversations like that, and people feel they're able to challenge in an appropriate way. It's also not a personality factor. There's no kind of correlations with personality factors here, or anything to say that, you know, extroverts or introverts or whatever have any different relationships. It's absolutely, it's not a personality factor. And also, it's not just another word for trust. So I think trust is one of the words that often gets kind of bounded around with psychological safety, and absolutely they're linked, but it's not the same. You know, kind of trust is more about you know, that one-to-one individual relationship, whereas psychological safety is more about the dynamic that happens in the group, and also it's more about the direction. So psychological safety, you know, trust is more about the fact, like, you know, do I think you know, I'm going to give Marshy the benefit of the doubt, whereas psychological safety is more, do I feel that this group is going to give me the benefit of the doubt, and what's that, and what's the impact of that? So they are linked, but it's not the same. We just need to be kind of a bit careful, on that.
I'm going to say, Lee, in response to your question that's just popped up there, we're going to try. We hope it doesn't fail, and I'm putting a huge amount of pressure. Apologies on Mandy here. We've got a poll coming up in a minute.
No, I'm running it, Marky.
Oh, you winning it? Oh, yeah. Loads of pressure on you then. That's cool. There's a poll coming up where we're going to hopefully try and play a little bit of a quiz, and Lee, in that your question might get should get answered through there in our perspective anyway. I think I'm going to build on that trust bit actually that Bex has alluded to there, and for those of you that have come across Lencioni's work on 5 dysfunctions of a team. I think it's really important to just highlight that teams that are lacking safety are incapable of having unfiltered, passionate debate about things. And we notice that will come through in teams where they aren't particularly safe. So to build on this idea that having an unfiltered, passionate debate, and to allude to what Beck's aligned to there, the group are going to give me benefit of the doubt, is absolutely crucial to all of this. And also on top of that, we also and particularly in football, recognise that there are probably a few examples of where having no psychological safety and potentially the sense of fear might work in the short term, and you might get some results. And there's some wonderful research out there on narcissistic leaders, particularly, that will have an early doors impact on performances, but don't particularly have that level of success for long term. So for me, the recognition that having high levels of psychological safety has a longer term benefit than fear or the leaders that lead with a hell of a lot of narcissism early doors in the way in which they create environments. And I will add one more point. It's something that we've been trying to make sure we think about from a practical point of view. Thinking about what psychological safety is not, and this idea around how we shape questions in environments in order to be really, really effective. Over lockdown, I think like a lot of us, we've sort of dipped into different things where we've had chance, so we've not been juggling kids or homeschool or anything like that. I've come into some of the work of a guy called Chris Voss, who is an FBI negotiator. Chris has got a wonderful book called Never Split the Difference. And whilst questioning has always been an important part of my training, he articulated something beautifully around the word why, and actually what the impact of the word and the question why has, and my interpretation is can have on safety, where Chris will talk about it can have in a negotiation situation. And it made me think, I've got a 4-year-old boy, and I can't count, I've lost count the amount of times through lockdown I've said, Teddy, why have you done that? And that sense of why is absolutely ingrained in children. Children get to ask why a hell of a lot. So it has a bit of a accusatory tone to it. So as we develop and as we go through adolescence and we become adults, even when someone asks you why, it can trigger some of the previous responses that we had when we were children. Okay, I'm being accused of something. So in psychologically safe environments where leaders and people are able to remove the term why from their language and add into it what caused that, as an example, is a really nice way to shift your language or shift your style. And again, that's not fluffy. That's just changing the way in which the tone, the type of question that you might use in order to create this environment, because it is something you have to work on every single day. So for those of you who haven't sort of come across that, I'd really have a little look at Chris Voss's work. I think it's brilliant, and it's a little bit different.
I think the final thing to consider on kind of what psychological safety is not is it is not about lowering performance standards. That's not what this is about. And you know, Amy Eberson's kind of early work here in terms of how psychological safety links to kind of standards, in terms of, you know, if we have high psychological safety but you end up with low standards, actually you end up in that top left box, that kind of comfort zone where, you know, people kind of coast along. They're not particularly not particularly challenged. They might not necessarily have aspiring goals, and you know, actually that's not particularly helpful. Whereas actually the aim ideally is you want to be in that top right hand box, you know, kind of that when learning and high performance zone, where actually it feels really safe. It feels like we can challenge in the most appropriate way. It feels like we can have really productive conflict and discussion, and we can chuck ideas out there that might not be fully formed yet, but we can, you know, work with other people to kind of create and finish them off. And that feels like the ideal place to be. And that absolutely might be the aspiration. And that's very nice when it fits into a four grid box. But actually, I think we also need to recognise that psychological safety is dynamic and it's constantly changing. So whilst you might be in that top right hand box at one point in time, the situation can change, things happen, different staff come in, different people come in, and then that shifts that dynamic in what everybody is experiencing. So it's not something that you kind of end up creating, you tick the box, say, great, we've got that psychologically safe environment, let's move on to something else. It's constantly shifting and evolving and constantly got to be worked out. And I think, you know, Marcia, we were saying, weren't we, that that's true also of us as kind of practitioners and our experiences in different environments.
Yeah, completely. I will just, Sophie has just put on there that Chris Voss has a masterclass online in addition to the book. That masterclass series online actually is exceptional. I mean, I've learned some unbelievable scrambled eggs from the Gordon Ramsay masterclass that's on that. But I would say, yeah, if people are interested, sorry, Beck, I had to bring that in. If people are interested, I think, yeah, that Chris Voss series on masterclass, which is an app, is is very well spent money. Bex, yeah, the anxiety zone. I cannot remember a time where I've stepped into an organisation and not been in the anxiety zone. I think when you work in high performance sport, there are naturally high standards. So every time I stepped into a new environment, whether it was England cricket or England football, I felt low safety because they're working me out and I'm working them out to some extent. But I'm going in where there's high standards. So I think it's normal to start off in that anxiety zone. Now, there are, of course, cultures where they will give you safety early on and they'll encourage you to be you, and that will help hugely. I think, but the expectation is, yeah, you may start off in the anxiety zone and try and work your way from there.
Yeah, and I think that's where we have to recognise that, like we say, you know, as psychologists, we're not immune to any of this stuff. We're very much part of this as well. So whilst we're trying to help create these environments, and we will get to some, we're trying to weave practical tips as we go, but we also will have a bit of a focus on practical tips shortly. But, you know, we are also experiencing these feelings as well ourselves. So it's not just about this happening over there in that environment we're working in. We are fully immersed and experiencing this ourselves as well. So it's that kind of dynamic of, you know, particularly when you work in environments in which you're embedded, you know, you've kind of got that dynamic to play out of how do I feel, but what am I also trying to create in the environment. One of the things we kind of alluded to earlier was about power, and we kind of love this quote from one of the Harvard professors around power is the last dirty word. It's easier to talk about the money, and it's much easier to talk about sex than it is to talk about power. Because generally when we speak about power, people have a real kind of negative connotation associated with it. But if we're going to start talking about this idea of psychological safety, you cannot do that without recognizing the impact of power and the dynamics of power. And Marsha and I, through our work at the FA, have been kind of fortunate enough to spend some time with a woman called Julie Diamond, who's based out in the States, and she's done lots of research into this area. She runs a consultancy working with sports and companies, mainly business, but doing some sport now, are kind of around understanding power and, you know, what power is. And she kind of, her definition of power is that it's, you know, the capacity to be able to alter a person's condition or state of mind. And actually, if we start to think about power and the impact that potentially we can have, but the people that we're working with, what kind of power, you know, what kind of power do they have? It's really important that we start to recognise that people, you know, do have types of power, and there are different, you know, there are different types of power. Some of you might be familiar with this in terms of original work from various people, French and Ravens, some to mention Julie's work, but just to kind of name a few examples of some of those types of power. You've got an example like positional power, which is the type of power that comes with the job that you're in. So as a head coach, for example, you know, they have positional power in their role. They're able to say, you know, select athletes or deselect athletes, decide the tactics, work out what they're doing. And, you know, the day they leave that role, they no longer have that power. But whilst they're in that, they have that sense of positional power. We talk about the notion of expertise power. You know, that means from a coaching perspective might be the technical knowledge or tactical knowledge that a coach has. You know, as a psychologist, it might be our particular specialisms and kind of the areas that we feel, you know, we've got that real sense of expertise in, and that gives us a sense of power within environments. There's also kind of power around that we kind of call contextual or informal power, and that's a really interesting one. And for me, particularly going into the football environment, I've been in football about 4 years now, but there's a real sense of contextual power in football in terms of how long have you been around football, how much do you know about the game, you know, who do you know, and that seems to really kind of supposedly give people some sense of power the longer they've been in football. And that for me is, particularly in football, is a really strong sense of power, more than it is in my experience in kind of in other sports. There's also physical power, our sense of presence that people potentially have when they walk, you know, when they walk into a room. So there's lots of different types of power, and in the work that we do when we're trying to create these psychologically safe environments, we need to have an awareness and an understanding of this and help people to work with the different types of power that they've got, and how can they start to kind of use some of the power they've got most effectively, and are they even aware of the power that they have and the impact that that can have on the people around them.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating topic, which I sort of Bex alluded to. I particularly got introduced to, having never really considered it at the FA. And one thing to really highlight here is that it is completely socially constructed. Like power is a completely socially constructed phenomenon. It is not right, it is not wrong, but it is something that we harness, and it is something that we use as human beings. And all I would say, I'm not going to go on and give too many answers away, because we're about to get up to a little quiz, is that there's no right or wrong with it.
Yeah.
But it can have a huge impact on people's perceptions.
So I think in the work that we've been doing in recent years, and particularly with kind of coaches and with staff, is helping them to have a greater understanding and awareness of that, and the impact that can have. And Marshy's really happy that you've managed to get I don't even know, Thor or something in this. I'm totally not a Marvel person, but might be able to explain why we've got some Marvel characters on the screen.
I'm not going to explain why I'm a bit of a Thor and Loki geek. That's not for today. But the idea that para creates distance, I think, is really, really crucial, because para stops people speaking up. And to use that example earlier that I used with a slightly feisty head coach, his power, both positional power, both contextual power, he had lots of different powers. Or power positions that he could use, meant that it had the potential for people not to speak up. An extremely experienced cricket coach and player, so people, I might not say this because, and that power created huge distance. So not only were we having a power dynamic at play there, but there was a sense of, is this safe to be me? Is this safe to be who I want to be in this environment? So we had to dig through all of that and try and solve that issue as quickly as possible. And so I think it is a reasonable time to highlight who said it. Someone asked a question about where is it? If you had a coach who did not have the awareness, how would you approach it? Well, fundamentally, your first port of call is get that relationship where you can then offer that feedback and then offer a solution. So in that instance, yes, I'd had a relationship with that coach, but I was able to say, I think I've got an idea about how I think we can solve this issue. So you cannot step into any space without awareness of self at first. So trying to sort of enhance their awareness of it through kindness, through compassion, through empathy. You don't just have to tell them, but then offer a solution. I often find that offering solutions to coaches that may or may not work. I mean, a lot of my solutions fail, but being in a position to put it out there would help, I think. But without knowing the real context, the personality of that human being, it is difficult. But getting a space to go, I think I've got something which may help, and there's a potential idea of what we could do, is a good starting point.
I don't think I mentioned it, but personal power is a type of relational power in terms of the relationships that we have with people. That in itself is a type of power. So like that really ability to build relationships is a real key sense of power that, do we use that enough? A practical example of kind of how power creates distance and stops people speaking up. I've been in a changing room before, like the day before a game, when the manager has named the team and only named 9 players. And you can kind of feel this sense of people thinking, I'm pretty sure we didn't just name 9 players there. Manager then walks out the changing room, and everyone kind of then goes, did he just name like 9 players? Like what's gone on there? But nobody in that moment wants to speak up against the manager to say, have you forgotten the wingers or whatever? Like no one wants to. It's like it's the point at which they walk out the changing room and everyone else then goes, okay, now we can have this conversation. And ideally you want the environment to be like, actually it's fine to say, sorry, but I think you might have forgotten a couple of people here. But it happens, and we see it.
But I just out of interest, Bex, how did that coach feel about that experience when it was made aware to him?
Yeah, I think he knew, and when I went out to the pitch, he'd gone out to set up. I was like, just to clarify that you've only named. He was like, yeah, I realised that. I think he was a bit disappointed that nobody had kind of said anything, but equally,
Absolutely.
you know, I think he probably, you know, recognises that that's the dynamics. But yeah, I think he would have preferred someone to say, you've forgotten me, or particularly the players that probably thought they were going to be playing and totally weren't named at all. But yeah, it's one of those.
And they're great learning moments, aren't they? If you can capture them right. So we talk about like best learning happens in context. You have a relationship with that head coach to dive in there and go, I've noticed this, what do you think?
Yeah.
And then to go with that emotion that they're experiencing, that's wicked coaching. And that's not easy, but it's great coaching. It makes the difference, doesn't it?
Yeah, I don't want to go too far off track. I've just seen a question come in about banter and bullying and harassment and stuff, and I'm conscious that we're probably already massively over time. But just to say, in the work that Julie Diamond does, it might be worth having a look at her work. She actually has something called a power profile, and actually people, it's like a 360-degree measure, and people can rate, you know, your Marshy's going to hold his up, I think, by the looks of it. Yeah, people can rate how they perceive your power and how you use your power. And actually that covers a bit of the kind of banter bullying stuff in that. So that's quite an interesting way, if people are willing. You've got to get people on board with it, but it is possible to kind of look at that kind of stuff.
I'd say it's brutal. Like we talk about lots of different psychometrics. Some guys will use Spotlight, Insights, Hogan, whatever it may be that you use. It's brutal. It's absolutely brutal because it's a 360 as well. But on my word, I learned a huge amount about me through that experience, and it was tough actually. Some of the reading of it was, ooh, ouch.
Talking about Spotlight, I think Andrew, might be new Andrew Wood, who asked earlier in the chat box about how can you differentiate between what you think psych safety is and what the general psych safety consensus is across players and staff. Spotlight have a brilliant tool called Spotlight Dynamics that you can do if you've done a Spotlight profile with the team, and the central measure in that is getting people to measure around psychological safety, so you can get some real good data back now around how that is perceived across the team, and it gives you really good insight in areas to work. That's probably worth looking at. Okay, I've never ever run a poll on Zoom, so let's see what happens. But we've got 4 questions.
Come on, I'm backing you.
For you. True, it's very simple. True or false. So I'm going to press launch polling and hope for the best.
Oh, yes, it's working.
Is it? Yeah. I mean, it's working on my screen, but I don't know if it is on everybody else. So yeah, get your votes in now for the 4 questions, and then we'll chat through a couple of these things.
So I'll read through them a little bit as you're ticking the screen, true or false. So if we get rid of hierarchy, would we eliminate problems with power? Great question. One of the biggest misuses of power is its underuse. Now, I gave a little teaser to that about 5 minutes ago. We'll see if people were listening. Ethical guidelines reduce misuse of power. I'm definitely going to hand over to you, Beck, because I'm palming that one off over to you. And your self-awareness is sufficient to prevent misuse of power.
Okay, you can see. Can Marshy, can you see the results coming in, or is it just me?
I cannot. I have no idea if this is working. Is it working?
It's working, yeah. We've had 112, 13, 14, 15. A few more to go. It's going up to 65% have voted now.
I'll be really honest. We started, I think it was 220 people. We've still got 215. So I'm really pleased we've not had a huge drop off at some point.
We've got 209, you know, so not too bad.
That'll work.
So I'll give you another couple of seconds, and then I'll end the poll.
No, I think Bex, I think 209 might be it, because there's 5 of us that can't vote.
Oh yeah.
Hosts and panelists can't vote.
Okay. So cool. I'm assuming if I end the poll, I'll still be able to see the results. Okay. So I'm going to press share results on here and see what happens.
Oh, that's working.
Is it?
Yeah, it's working.
Okay.
Well, do you know what's killing me now? So I've got my iPad next to me, so the notes that we've made, and I've lost the answers. I'm just trying.
I can tell you the answer.
I found them. It's good. I'm happy. I found them.
Do you want to kick off with that first one then, Marshy?
Well, that was why I was panicking, because it was supposed to be me that gives the reason for the first one, wasn't it? Yeah, absolutely false. False is the perfect answer there. And one of the things I'll consider is that the opposite of so hierarchy is as we traditionally know it. You have a gaffer, they sit down, very built in the Industrial Revolution. There are other versions of how organisations are set up. Like egalitarian is a great example, where we have quite a flat structure. what we know, and I'm going to go back to the point I made earlier, is that it's a socially constructed idea of power. So even if you remove hierarchy and you go to an egalitarian approach with sort of flat leadership, people will still have expertise power at different times. As Bex talks about contextual power, individual power, you'll still come at it from a different perspective. Hence the socially constructive nature to it. So guys that went for false there, absolutely bang on. I'm loving the fact that number 2 is so close, by the way, as well.
Yeah, really close there. So 56-44 true. That one is true. You know, we talk about this idea that power it kind of has this negative connotation, but actually power it's not good or bad. I think Marcy mentioned it earlier. It's kind of this neutral sense, the neutral energy, and actually it can be absolutely used for good and used to create really positive change. And actually, again, if people don't have that sense of awareness, of understanding, like, what are some of the powers that I do have? We talked before about relational power, or how do people use their expertise power? Actually, are we consciously making an effort to use our power in the right way? It's a little bit like, you know, in kind of the positive psychology stuff, we talk about how good are we at actually knowing what our strengths are, and then not just knowing them, but then exploiting them. And it's similar with power. Can we really work out, how do we actually, you know, we've got some expertise power potentially, how do we really use that power that we've got for good and to really create and make a difference? So absolutely, you know, one of the biggest misuses is power is that people do not use it enough.
I think power falls into that same bracket as people will hear the term narcissism and go, oh, we don't want narcissists in our team. Whereas I'm thinking narcissism going, well, I definitely want people who are a couple of players that are high narcissists, because they're the ones that are going to want to take me over the line. We as human beings, we absolutely have some labels which we put positive connotations to and some we put negative connotations to. The more we can have neutral perspectives on these things and use them appropriately, I think is a better place for us to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. This one around ethical guidelines reduce power misuse. Yeah, it's an interesting one. This it's actually false. And part of the reason it's false is because it's probably a bit of a play on words, but ethical guidelines alone are not enough to reduce power misuse. You know, obviously there are cases absolutely where power is misused intentionally, shall we say, but generally speaking, kind of like laws and guidelines work really well with people who are high in compliance and high in conscientiousness. And generally the people that misuse power intentionally aren't high in those qualities, and actually as a result of that, the ethical guidelines don't tend to have much impact for them, because they're not, you know, compliant enough in the first place to be using them. So don't get me wrong, ethical guidelines can help in some cases, but actually in terms of being the thing that can reduce power misuse, it's not actually as effective as kind of like we might think it would be.
Yeah, and Julie, we've alluded to Julie's work as we've gone through it. She's got a wicked article on which gives a bit more context to some of these. Is it LinkedIn, Bex, that article is? We can put we can make a little. Yeah, we can make it about, or we can definitely share the link at the end of this. And then, yeah, last one, that your self-awareness is sufficient to prevent power misuse. Let's go back to this notion of it being a neutral term, not a negative term, and the answer there is absolutely false. There are times where I would want people to use their sense of power more often, and do not do that. And your social sphere has a greater influence on your behaviour than me will often allude to. And I won't apologise for saying it again. This is a socially constructed construct rather than something that is very different to that. So I think that's important to recognise. And I'm buzzing that has worked, Bex, by the way.
Yeah, me too. Technology is yeah. I just noticed someone in the chat, but I couldn't see my chat box, so I had the other thing over it. But someone said if power is used in a positive way, doesn't get called power? Yeah, possibly. Or maybe talk about if we were to say the word powerful or something like that, maybe that's got more positive. But definitely language absolutely gets in the way of things.
Well, I'll touch. We're getting towards the end now, and at the end we're going to talk about some real specific, some practical examples, and it would also get back to we're going to talk a little bit about shared mental models later, and if within your organisation and in your sort of ecosystem that you're operating in, power is seen as a more neutral or if anything a positive term to use. Again, go back to socially constructed. If your organisation sees it as positive and the social environment interaction that you have hears the word power and sees it as a helpful thing, then it matters less than the external stuff.
Yeah. Will, your question, I think we'll cover off in the practical tips there. So just to clarify, kind of so far what we've been through really is about what psychological safety is, and also really importantly what it isn't. We've tried to allude to kind of some of the research that's behind this and the link into performance, and also as we've just gone through there, kind of really starting to recognise the impact of power, and we really need to make sure we consider that when we're doing that work. But ultimately, if we want to step into this space of psychological safety and power, then there's going to be certain things that we need to consider in order for us to do this.
Yeah, so we put a movie ticket in here around Admit One, and we're trying to think of the best image really to describe permission. My early training, and I have to thank a huge amount of people at the IS for helping me get a great start into my career. And working at the IS, there's a very, very clear model. I think a few of you, obviously, who work for the IS will see it. Hopefully people that have seen it externally, sort of that triangle with a real base of solid mental health at the bottom that then works through, and I'm just going to make sure I get my order right, so look at my notes: system, dynamics, individual, training and competition. So, or an individual support that sits within, system, dynamics, individual, training and competition as a different levels that as psychologists you can work at. Then we're talking about actually and actively working on psychological safety. We're talking about working at the systems level. And that requires for me a couple of things. One, it requires permission. When we work in elite sport, we're often brought in for multiple things. As psychologists, we have to have broad skill sets, be it the one-to-one work, the dynamic work that we might do with teams, all those pieces. And it may be that we just don't simply have the permission to work at that level because the performance director, the head coach, hasn't seen the need yet. We may be brought in to work at a team dynamic level, at an individual level, whatever it may be. So recognizing where your permission is to do this work, I think, is crucial. But that's not to say you can't influence it. So developing a skill set to work at the systemic level and work with the multidisciplinary teams, to work with the coaching staff, similar to how we work at the FA by choice and by design, is a skill set that we have to add. That means for me that when you step into an environment, and if you are in to deliver maybe primarily one-to-one work, or you're in to deliver work with the team and to create some cohesion, or whatever the term is that you initially brought in on, have the systems like glasses on. What am I seeing? What do I need to work on here? Who do I need to influence to try and make sure we are building safety? We do have a culture for learning. We do have some effective profiling maybe that supports our athletes. We review well, we plan well. Just because you didn't come in on those roles doesn't mean you can't add to those roles and that understanding, but that comes back to permission. So I think people may leave here going, yeah, brilliant. I'm hoping I've got loads of things to work on. Context and permission, two really, really crucial things to make sure you get right.
Sorry, I was just reading.
I missed anything there.
Yeah, I was just reading Paula's question and Matthew's question there. Hopefully we'll come to those a little bit in the tips in a second. But Paula's asked here around, in those examples where people that feel they've got less power to start with, how do you kind of empower them to speak out? And I definitely think, and it's probably only since I've been at the FA that I've really started to kind of look into the idea of power more specifically, but actually working with people to help them understand actually what type of power do they have. So, just if you've got the opportunity to even do some one-to-one work with those people in terms of, whether it's their expertise power, whether it's their personal power, whether they do have some positional power, or just in terms of their own identity, what kind of power might they feel that they do have and what they can offer. So I think there's some really powerful work, not to meant to do the pun, but kind of work with, to work with around that. So yeah, Matthew will kind of come on to that shortly in terms of kind of creating safe. Well, I say shortly, probably now actually, in terms of creating that kind of. Yeah,
let's get on. Let's get on to this next slide so we can answer some questions if people feel the need to. So I talked earlier about one of my sort of crushes on Google. I've also become a bit of a fan of Michael Gervais' work, who's a psychologist with the Seattle Seahawks. I'm probably stalking him a little bit too much at the moment. I've come across it was a wonderful story about his first experience in the Seattle Seahawks. And they articulated, him and Pete Carroll just articulated something which I felt, and I'm going to read it from a piece of paper so I make sure I do it justice. just felt right to me around safety and how how important it is. And fundamentally, what I've learned from the Seahawks, and actually I can say I do feel fortunate that the former head of physical preparation at Seattle Seahawks is a guy called Dean Riddle, who I worked with at Sheffield United back in 2008. So I wanted to check on this. Is like, are they selling this as a story, or is this actually true? And Dean corroborated it and said, no, this is absolutely how they work. And their culture is built on relational rather than outcome. Outcome will happen because of wonderful relationships that are built within their system. And to read sort of a couple of the comments here, the coaches articulated that it feels like I can be myself and that I matter. And their vision is built on relationships, which is the building blocks for understanding. So if you get solid relationships, you can then understand, and therefore holding people in high regard, independent of performance output. I want to say that again, holding people in high regard, independent of performance output. That's a big statement to make. But for me, it just feels right. Like, you bring people through the door based on their qualifications and their experiences. So hold them in high regard and let them be themselves and let them be who they are. Now, I love that. For me, I get goosebumps when I hear about organisations that work like that. And yeah, that for me is the essence of intrinsic motivation. Like, I base a lot of my work around self-determination theory. And if I think the three building blocks of self-determination theory, for me, are covered in that. Hold people in high regard, independent of performance outcome. Let them explore their potential. That, for me, is one of the best places to start to shift a culture that is relational over outcome. And I think Kath Bishop's most recent article in the Daily Mail is sort of alluding to the fact that it shouldn't be about performance or well-being. It's an either or. It's an either. Let me get that right. Shouldn't be performance over well-being. It's a and. Have I got that right there? And.
Yeah, not one or the other.
And well-being. Yeah. One or the other. There you go. I lost my trail of thoughts there. Yeah. It's not one or the other. It's both, and we know that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So.
I think it's really important to say at this point as well, when we're talking about psychological safety, and particularly when we're talking about, shift cultures, we put that as a tip. We really recognise that this work is difficult. This is not easy work, and it is not work that happens overnight. It is something that has to constantly be chipped away at, worked at. Both of us have been, probably people on this call have been in environments where you sometimes feel like you're the only person banging the drum. But, when you truly believe this and you know the difference it can make, it is worth sticking to where you can.
Yeah.
Just want to kind of just share a couple of things from my example, like, oh no, what have I done there? Oh, it's all right. I thought on my screen, the chat box took the entire screen up there, but I thought that was happening on everyone's screen. This idea of kind of creating space and, prompts for people to be able to talk about emotion. So a really simple example of something that I've done, which actually has probably been one of the most effective things I've done in terms of helping people to talk about emotions, was with the staff group, with the men's 21s that I work with. And before we had a staff meeting, I printed off like emojis, the emojis we use on our phone, everything from the dancing emoji to happy emoji to crying emoji, all sorts of emojis. And I basically just scattered them all over the floor of the meeting room. So when the staff came and the MDT came into the room, they had to go and stand on an emoji that represented how they were feeling at that point in time. And, you got a bit of banter about, what's this all about when we first went in, but it was really powerful in helping people to go, do you know what, actually, and we had a variety. We had some people that had like a really bad day, some people had a great day, and we talked through it, and people talked through, okay, what is it that's meant you've gone and stand on the really happy emoji? Or why have you gone and stood, on the dancing emoji? Why are you standing on the crying emoji? Just almost providing people with the space, but also a prompt that helps them to go, if we'd just sat around in a circle and I'd said, Marshy, how do you feel? It's hard to kind of speak that up. Whereas if you've got a prompt that you can use that goes, well, actually, the reason I was attracted to this particular, feeling or emoji is this. So it was actually really powerful, more so, to be honest, than I was probably expecting. And it's something I've tried to kind of try to do since. But that idea of trying to create the space to help people speak about how they're feeling. And also, like, I think someone mentioned earlier in the questions about kind of staff well-being, one of the things we've tried to do as well is there's lots of focus on athletes and players and monitoring everything they do. But one of the things we've tried to do at the FA is think about staff wellbeing as well. And certainly when I've gone to kind of Euros and stuff, and also when we're away from home, we do daily staff monitoring as well, where staff have a series of questions that they write that only comes into me as a psychologist. So at that point, nobody else sees it. And then they've got, fill in some questions and ratings, but there's also space to then write anything they want to write. And I think, people have kind of really taken to that, to being able to go, actually, people care about me. Actually, it's not just about the players, it is, about me as well. And I think that's really good. I just see Nikki's come in here with thanks, saying like the emoji idea, and the Academy Island at Arsenal is another good example. Kate Green, I think, is on this call. So absolutely shout out to Kate as well for the work she's done on Academy 100%. Island at Arsenal. If you've not seen it, I'm sure if you Google it, that will come up because it got featured in some things. It's brilliant way.
Yeah, YouTube. It's on. There's a wicked, there's a really cool video on YouTube with it, and I think a testament to what they're doing at Arsenal. I think it's a quality piece of work. I was amazed when I went down to Arsenal to chat with Kate and to see it. I was like, yeah, this is a good piece of work. This
brilliant.
It's brilliant, and it's published as well. Actually, I think, isn't it? It's published as a journal article, so there's some proper research around it, as well as what he's done. And I think that goes back to evidence-based practice. It's just quality. Definitely.
And I also put on here, I talked about this one earlier, but this idea of stepping into the players' needs, not your own needs. So sometimes we can get caught up about thinking what we need, and I think to some extent maybe this comes with experience as a practitioner. Like I sort of certainly felt as a young practitioner, I had to constantly be in control all the time. So the idea of probably giving loads of ownership over to athletes was probably quite daunting. Whereas now it's kind of actually, what's the needs of these players? What's the needs of this group in front of me? Actually, how are we able to kind of get into their needs and what they want? Actually, we can get annoyed about the amount of time they're on the phone, or we can embrace that and say, right, let's use this then. Let's use the technology to kind of really help things along. So try and step into their needs as opposed to your own, to try and kind of create that space.
Yeah. So the person, I think one of the things that I was really proud of when I worked at England Cricket, and I think this will work across multiple organisations and not just cricket, was before every tour we went to, we would do a session where we use insights at the time, where we'd go through all the members of staff insights profiles, but we'd also talk about the stuff that actually really mattered, as in, you're going to be away for 5 weeks. What are you most concerned about? Actually, what are you going to miss? Is it going to be a little boy's birthday while you're away? Are you missing like events with your mates? Are you missing weddings? In cricket, we miss so much stuff. So we actually put all that on the table and agreed a buddy system. And quite often, look, you know what, Marshy? I know you'll come in and check on me, but I feel as though I've got a really good relationship with Sarge over there, head coach. I want Sarge to be my buddy, and we'll agree that we check in once a week. But we'll also know it's Hoppo's little daughter's birthday on the 17th. Let's make sure we sort of check in on that. And those things goes back to everything that we've said here. Hold people in high regard and get to know the person behind the staff member. And I think when you leave organisations and they still do stuff that you put in place when you were there, it's often a testament of whether it was valued or whether it was still working. I feel fortunate that is something that they still do prior to tours, to really make sure that well-being of staff is absolutely pivotal. That needs safety to do that. It needs people to be willing to stand there and say, yeah, things are a bit tough at home at the moment, and I'm a bit concerned about going away. And if I'm not great, it might look a little bit like this, and I might need a bit of help. And they got better. The more we did it, the more it got better. And just to reiterate, like, this isn't short-term fixes, but it's stuff that matters, and stuff that matters. And to talk about like Pippa Grange, who was mine and Becky's line manager up until recently at the FA, we'll talk about like going deep, do deep work. And that for me is an example of that. Let's do stuff that matters and do stuff that's deep.
And I think linked to that, Marsh, it's that thing, isn't it, of also having a conversation with those people around, really appreciate people sharing that. And then what do they need? Because for some people, once they let people know that, they might not need anything else from anybody else, but some other people
Agreed.
Actually might need someone to be able to talk to that about every day. So I think that piece of work around, okay, what, if you're experiencing some of these things, like what is it that you need from other people? And then if we can share that and have that awareness of what each person in the team needs, then that creates those really, really strong relationships. It reminded me of like something we did a couple of years back called Guardian Angels, where each staff member had a buddy, but it was like secret, so it's called their Guardian Angels, so no one knew who each other's person was. So it was your job for that tournament to kind of look after them, check in on them, but you didn't know who was doing it. So like, you know, if you're sitting at breakfast and someone brings you a cup of tea, you're like, oh, I wonder if they could be my guardian angel. And it kind of ended up being this quite fun thing, where people were trying to guess, and then kind of at the end we kind of revealed who had who. Yeah, I think the other thing, it's interesting, Marcy mentioned there about Pippa Grange, who was our boss, like kind of one of the things we try to do is practice what we preach a little bit. We talk about this stuff around, you know that in order to be safe, people have to take a little bit of an interpersonal risk or be vulnerable. And actually, as practitioners, do we practice what we preach? How willing are we to kind of tackle and have the courage to tackle some of these like hard basket topics? So we've run over the last couple of years what we've called a masterclass series. So in kind of the first year, we looked at diversity, which was helping, and this was for coaches, national coaches across both men's and women's pathways, and looking at diversity, helping people to understand the importance of diversity within the system, understanding people's heritage, why that's important, looking at looking at generational differences as well, and can we understand some of the diversity around that. We looked at power, so some of the stuff we've shared with you today, we went in deep with coaches for a day on that, around power, and actually it was probably some of the best feedback we had that year was around that topic. And I think one of the coaches said that, you know, normally you do a course and at the break, you know, when you go and get your coffee, you're talking about everything else, but the power was kind of the one topic that seemed to really resonate, where people kind of were still talking about it. I think partly because people just hadn't really thought about some of that stuff before. We talked about ethical leadership, we did a day on that, and we also talked about coach burnout. I don't know if Pete Olsoga's on the call today. I think he might have been, but if he is, Pete came in and delivered for that, and that was a really great session as well. Think about
and I think, yeah, look, I mean, sorry to jump in there, Bex. I mean, but for those of you who know me, like I was absolutely out of my comfort zone at the beginning of the last season. We did what was for me a really, really important day where we looked at sexuality and identity with our coaches on our female pathway, on the female aspect of the pathway, and the plan will be to do it on the men's aspect of the pathway as well. And that was I had to do some deep learning at that period of time, and we had a collaborative piece with Stonewall, where Stonewall came in and supported me and supported our coaches around delivering that topic. And that goes back to practice what you preach. I felt really uncomfortable standing up, talking about sexuality and identity and the use of pronouns appropriately and how that looks. And that was tough, but it was brilliant. And we have to go there more often. And that means we have to put ourselves in uncomfortable places to do that. So yeah, if we're going to encourage psychological safety, tackle some hard baskets yourself. And Beck's going in ethical leadership. I remember that day really well. That was a tough day, but it was a great day. And they're not easy.
We took people to the cinema for that day and got them to watch Gone Baby Gone. I don't know if anybody's ever seen that film, but if you haven't, I highly recommend watching it. It's got some hard concepts in it, but it's from an ethical perspective, it's brilliant to kind of debate. And
then bringing it back, and we brought it back. We brought it back to coaching, to football, because that was what was important, and it always comes back, but we use different mediums to bring it back.
Yeah.
Create shared mental models. If anyone works in my team, they'll know I bang on about shared mental models all the time. For me, consistency of language.
Andrew's just asked, I'm sorry, Marty, but just Andrew's asked about what advice you give for those who want to encourage psych safety with smaller systems, less time, not immersed. This shared mental model would be a good one.
100%, all day long. Like, I mean, to pinch a football term, if I'm in a coaching session or I'm watching coaches coach, you'll hear them shout something like break lines. And break lines means so many different things. It means play the ball forward. It means run forward. It basically means travel forward. But you've got multiple options to do it. But it's a shared mental model that as soon as a coach shouts break lines, it's 2 words and everyone knows what it means. And they then go and do it. We are rubbish at doing that in psychology. We have so many labels for stuff. Resilience, mental toughness, hardiness. It doesn't matter where we go. There is so much inconsistency in the language we use. We make it difficult for us as psychologists. I'll get off my high horse. I'll come back down. But when you're in a system, and to answer your question, Woody, a little bit there, get a clear, like when we say resilience, what do we mean? When we say openness, conscientiousness, when we say drive, whatever it is we use, I'm less bothered about what we go after pragmatically in a system. I'm more bothered about, does everybody know what that is? So we have a shared mental model. That is then helpful. That creates opportunity for far better check and challenge. So I guarantee you'll have sat in meetings and you've gone, oh, you need to be a bit more resilient. And coaches go, oh, yeah, definitely needs a bit more of that. What is it? What are we talking about? Once you get that shared mental model, look at Becky's smiling because she sees me, I'm on my high horse again. Once we get that, it's then a lot easier to say yes, no. What makes you say that? Etc. etc. Sorry.
I'm smiling in part as well because it reminded me in a really simple example. It reminded me of when I first started working with one of the teams I work with, and you talked earlier, Marshy, about that idea of when you first get into an environment, and actually it might be almost like the anxiety zone where you kind of like the standards are high, but you haven't really figured out your place yet and not sure what you're doing. And I remember a coach said to me, yeah, but let's meet up, but we'll meet after dinner. So I'm like, yeah, great. And then we had lunch, and then the coach said to me, come on then, let's go. And I was like, what do you mean? And he's like, well, we said we'll meet after dinner. And I'm like, yeah, dinner, like as in like tonight, so we're not meeting at like 8 after dinner. He's like, dinner, lunchtime, dinner is lunchtime. I was like, what? So like even a really simple thing, and we actually ended up, it probably sounds stupid, but we actually ended up doing a session on communication based around different terminology of like what's dinner mean to people, like when is that, like really simple bits of language that actually when you've got a different definition of that, you can end up getting yourself into a real mess, and it just gets complicated. But yeah, maybe that's what I was
100%.
I was also looking at
I was going to dive in on that. I was going to, Pete, you are correct. Dinner is evening. I think actually my preference is to do as little in the classroom as possible. Actually, Elliot, in that sense, it's I'm again, my philosophy is built on context is everything. So the more we can do in relationship with the coach when they're putting a session on, how are we interweaving the key psychological aspects that we want to get out of that session related to the demands of the game? So if we know what the key psychological demands of the game are, then I work closely with the coach to try and tweak the way in which they operate to show that up on the pitch. Then if we have to do some stuff in the classroom afterwards, yeah, of course, it's helpful. My preference would be classroom happens at some point, but it would not be the go-to if we can get learning on the grass. And that for me is the same whether I'm working in football or historically when I was at cricket.
Yeah, the other thing in relation to that is when we did the masterclass series, we kind of split it up. I mean, we were doing it in a football context, so we talked about preparation time. Before we did a particular topic, we might send readings or articles or videos for coaches to watch. We had actual delivery that was game day. We called game day, so kind of class and game day. And then we had an extra time. An extra time was, was about additional resources we could send them, but also to set up smaller kind of sessions. We might say, "Oh, come and meet us in the dugout." That's our internal restaurant. Come and meet in the dugout for a cup of tea and a coffee, and let's chat through some of that stuff on power. Let's chat through some of the stuff on diversity, and how do you have conversations with your players around their heritage and what that means to them, and so almost like kind of that piece afterwards. We don't want to just do the day. We almost frame the day as like, this is just the start point. This is literally barely scratching the surface, and then we want to absolutely want to follow that up later on.
Yeah, and I think that we go back to that point, and don't quote me on this, but it's over, I think it's around the 70% mark, it may be slightly higher or slightly lower, of players in the England football pathway that could play for a different country, have dual heritage. But we can't ignore that. We've got to do work. We've got to do stuff with that. We have to work effectively around that, which means upskilling for me and for Bex and for the coaching system. The only way you learn that is by getting to know the identity of the players and what it means to them. And that's pivotal work. Yeah,
absolutely. We also talk about this idea of kind of, role modeling and the importance of that in terms of being vulnerable and needing people to role model that, and particularly from leadership as well. And often, we talk about that the leadership drives the culture initially, and it's kind of how do we work with some of the leaders or the coaches or performance directors to really kind of set that up from the top, because if they're willing to do it and with a genuine interest, then that really helps. Certainly, like within our team, we have a I'm going to call it a mess up club, because although Marshy swore earlier, I do not want to join the swearing club on the webinar. I'll let you off. So we call it the mess up club. I'm sure you can imagine what we really call it. In our team, where basically, if we've had a bit of a shocker, or a session's gone wrong, or we've had a bit of a nightmare, like we actively tell the rest of the group about it and talk about it, because we're really acutely aware that, we're going to make mistakes, we're going to get things wrong, and that's all part of us learning and developing, and also that might help stop someone else making the same mistake that we did. So yeah, there's definitely that idea of role modeling and wanting to try and create that, particularly from a leadership perspective, if you can do that. The other bit I think about, sorry, just in terms of leadership, is often if a head coach or performance director or someone in a position of power, like ask people for an opinion, you really have to encourage them not to give their own opinion first, because as soon as that person deemed to be in the position of power has given their view, you almost end up in that situation with a bit of confluence where people just agree with that for the sake of agreeing, rather than actually the leader holding back, getting everyone else's views, and then perhaps sharing their own view after that.
Absolutely. Again, if you want better answers, I'm losing my ability to speak here now. I've done too many to answer some questions. If you want better answers, ask better questions. I've got 3 questions right down here, which I think are wonderful questions around psychological safety. Again, taken from a bit of a combination of some of Amy Evans' work, some of the stuff from Chris Voss. And I think as a leader, and this is where I think our role can be really pivotal in supporting leaders, it is getting leaders into a position that might ask you questions such as this. What did I do that meant you didn't want to come to me? Like, what is it that I did that meant it stopped you from coming to me or stopped you from saying that? Because we can then start to really understand maybe power position, for example, or could be anything in that sort of sense. Asking a leader to reflect, like, what does my power position mean to the people around me? I think is a really great question to ask, and a really important reflection. And then the final question I've pinched here, my wife works in public health, and throughout this lockdown period, we often sat at the same dining room table, sort of working. And she was on a webinar recently around resilience, around adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, led by Professor Warren Larkin. And half listening in, half doing some of my work at the same time. But then my ears pricked when Warren said this. He said, "It is far better to ask what has happened to them rather than what is wrong with them." That's resonated with me so much since then. And I can think of many times coaches may have said, "Oh, what's wrong with them?" And I think it's far better, isn't it, if we could stand there and say, what has happened to them, to then help us understand why a player may have responded in that way. And therefore, I think it gives you a very, very different perspective on what you then might do. So having in your mind, especially when you might hear a coach, or I say coach, I'd be absolutely as guilty of that, of saying that. What's happened to, what's wrong with them? Actually, what's happened to them, I think, is a really wicked reframe.
And you may be pleased to hear the final thing we have to say is kind of, and this is for maybe Edmonton, she talks about the idea of like being really clear around how you frame sessions and how you respond. So the 3 things she talks about for creating psychological safety is frame the session. So, it might be if you're doing something new, for example, you say to people, look, we might get this wrong. It might not be spot on first time. This could be a draft. It might be like, let's give it a try and see what happens. Think about the language you use and how you really kind of frame the session to kind of create the right environment from the beginning. Invite engagement, obviously, from people, encourage people. It's no good saying you want to hear from people and then you don't speak to them. Amy Edmondson in one of her talks thinks about a great, it might be Megan Ritz actually, who's done some work, who's in the UK around, leaders who say my door is always open, and then actually their office door, is always shut. So they metaphorically talk about that my door is always open, but actually don't necessarily mirror the behaviours. So actually, how do you then think about you invite engagement? And then when you do invite engagement, how do you respond to people when they do share things with you? And I think hopefully one of the things we've tried to do today is have this kind of engagement with people, albeit through the chat box, not being able to see you, but to try and go, actually, we want you to be engaged in this, but also we want to be able to try and respond to that. Because I think that's really important as well. I know there's a thing on here, I don't know if it's Jennifer Lace or Jay Lace, but Jennifer, it might be you. I don't know if people have read this, but I did this with language, went on an EIS workshop, came back to football talking about looking at our systems. The head of coaching thought I meant change our systems, shape of play. And I think that's the thing, isn't it? Absolutely, we can get ourselves into these situations when we don't have a shared mental model. We're talking about different things. We're in environments where we've got kind of differences in the way these things go on. And actually, we want to be able to kind of have some of these conversations, but recognizing some of those nuances as well. So really think about that in terms of how you frame a session. How do you go about inviting engagement so you're more likely to get people to speak up? And also, how do you respond? So we talk about this word responsibility, your ability to respond. How are you doing that? And how are you working with people in positions of power so that they respond appropriately, so that people don't shut down next time they continue to to be open.
I think I'm going to just jump in on Irina's comment, and I really hope I pronounced your name right there. Apologies if I haven't. How do you approach when the leadership team expects you as a psychologist to fix the problem, or expecting you as the expert to resolve the issue? That's a wonderful question. And actually, I'll go back to the question I sort of alluded to earlier when you talk about a player, rather than what's wrong with them, what's happened to them. I think it's a really great question to then think about. Wonder what that coach's experiences are of psychology historically. Unpick that first, and that will give you a far better base to then operate from. So if you're expected, okay, I want you to come in and fix a problem, absolutely get in. What is it that you've experienced in the past that has made you think that that's the best way to use psychology? Start to really dig into what some of those questions might be, because once you understand what their intention is behind your work, it then gives you a really stable base to either go, absolutely, I can do that, but I want to also sort of let you know that I might contract a little piece of work over here, because I think I could support you here as well. So that it just becomes through that relationship, understand their perspective on psychology and go from there.
I think one of the philosophies we've tried to have as well is that psychology is everybody's business. So we might absolutely be in the environment, being the person who perhaps starts off some of these things, tries to generate some of these things, helps to facilitate, but we are not solely responsible for the creation of psychological safety. Every single person is involved in that. Yeah. And I think that's one of the, from a cultural perspective, is things to help people understand. We absolutely have a role to facilitate that, but it's everybody's responsibility.
I love my job to bits. I think it's the best job in the world. It is the only job as a psychologist, though, but everyone has got experience of being psychologists, whether it's at home, with your family, with your kid. Like, they might not be qualified and have the HCPC registration and gone through your stage 2 or your SEPAR. They might not have done that, but everyone has experience on having a positive or unhelpful impact on someone else's psychology, which means that people have experiences. They go, oh, I know it'll work, this will work. And it might. But let's help educate the system around what we're going after, and then don't feel too precious if you're not the one that's doing it. I've had to learn that. I quite like I'm an only child. I like being the centre of attention sometimes, but I had to learn really quickly that absolutely, if the system gets better and the athlete or develops or improves and delivers, that's because we are all doing this together. Paul, I think we're done. You might be asleep.
I think we are. I thought the sort of marshalling the sorry about the pun, but the Q&A would be quite a tough ask, the way the questions are raining in. But I think you managed to address a lot of those questions. There was just one. I just want to check you did the one you asked me, Marshy, to come back to, which was from Michael. Would athletes capable of separating who they are as people from their athlete identity feel more empowered to ask for and take critical feedback? I think you probably have addressed that.
I mean, I'm happy
I think I'd say. I mean, I think Bex is I might do a little what's the word I'm looking for? A little pitch for Bex here. She did a wicked podcast, Bex did, with Simon Monday about athletic identity probably a year or so ago, which is definitely worth a listen. I'm embarrassed by saying that, but yeah, it's really, really good. 2 years ago, Bex, you did that?
Yeah, 18 months ago. Yeah, don't tell me the score.
Yeah, no, it's really, really good. But yeah, Bex is I'm sure can cover that off.
I didn't. So was it like if someone's able to separate out their identity, they might be more able to take critical feedback? Was that the? Yeah, I mean, potentially. I don't think, as far as I'm aware, I might be wrong, there's necessarily any research to back that up. But certainly, you know, if we think about someone who's got a really strong athletic identity, their entire sense of self-worth and well-being is wrapped up in that. So actually, when stuff is going wrong, then actually potentially they could take that to be a lot more difficult. But the flip side of that might say that actually if someone's got a really strong athletic identity, because it's so important to do well, actually they might have more of the type where actually they are almost the opposite, that they're craving so much of that critical feedback that they could potentially get overwhelmed with the amount of information coming in at them if they're going to really analyze everything to the nth degree. So I think that for me would be less about the strength of the athletic identity. Well, the strength of athletic identity would be important, but I think the differentiating factor would be more some of their personality factors rather than the athletic identity on its own.
Okay, we could carry on for so much longer. It's clearly been a topic that's really resonated. I know you're hugely respected for the way you really focus on evidence-based practice. That's really come through, but just thanks to everybody for attending and sharing their own experiences and practices. But Chris, Rebecca, Denise, Mandy, thanks ever so much. Just total pleasure. Just a reminder to everybody that the webinar will be accessible within 7 days of the webinar. So if you registered, which obviously everybody has, you'll be able to click on the link and download the presentation. So sorry we couldn't address, there were Q&A questions in there as well as the chat, but hopefully we'll have a chance somewhere of following up. But we'd like to get the feedback, of course. Any chance to feedback on the webinar today in the last series, please do. Otherwise, I think we shall close off. Chris, Rebecca, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thanks for listening as well.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you.